2 or 3 days ago or a week ago, one of my colleagues, Danny Murphy, was advocating that Gareth Southgate and Steve Holland should be managing Manchester United. We can't go from a feast to a famine overnight. Welcome to this week's edition of One-to-One with Simon Jordan. Of course, as always, keep liking and subscribing and keep leaving your questions in the comment section below. There is a growing narrative about Gareth Southgate and I don't quite know where it's coming from. I'm not a huge admirer of his, but I respect the achievements that he's brought to bear because his predecessors have got nowhere near what he's achieved. Now we can look at the draws, and I'm a major advocate of saying that the World Cup was a draw that was from heaven, and so was the European Championships. Yet we never won the World Cup semi-final against Croatia when it was in our hands, and we never won the European Championships when it was also in our hands. Both of those games needed changes. Southgate showed a lack of ability to make changes to affect the outcome of the game. But notwithstanding all of that, he's delivering from a golden generation. We've had these golden generations before. The narrative that's building up, and I don't know where it's coming from, I wonder sometimes if it's some of the observations that Southgate makes off the pitch about how the players should do certain things, whether it's what he expects for his players, whether it's the taking of the knee or a variety of things that people are pushing back on, or whether it's because at times he can be just a tad pious. But I think it's laughable to consider taking Southgate out on the cusp of a World Cup that natural progression says that we should potentially win. I'm not suggesting that we should get all gung-ho and full of British bravado about what we're entitled to, but we're in a tournament that has no excuses behind it in terms of tiredness and overuse of players. We don't have the climatic situation because the temperature in Qatar won't be off the clock, so we have all of it stacked in our favour. Only of course if key players get injured, then you have to factor those components in. But I don't think he's bottling it. I think he is what he is. It's a scorpion and a frog. He does what he does. He's a defensive-minded individual because he was a defender as a player. He was a safe pair of hands as a player. And I think that you see what you see. I mean, these two European nations games are meaningless. You know, I realise that we've tried to make these tournaments better than just friendlies and give it more jeopardy and more traction in these games. But that notwithstanding, 2 or 3 days ago or a week ago, one of my colleagues, Danny Murphy, was advocating that Gareth Southgate and Steve Holland should be managing Manchester United. We can't go from a feast to a famine overnight. I maintain that giving Gareth Southgate a new contract prior to this tournament was ludicrous because he's a tournament manager. Qualifies England should qualify for every tournament they should. They're not Scotland, they should qualify for every single tournament. So with that in mind, I don't think he's bottling it. I think he is what he is. And of course, a lot of players are being trialled, Jared Bowen and so on and so forth. People are being given opportunities. Ignore these European nation games. Get behind the team and let's cheer or castigate Southgate based upon Qatar. If I was still at Palace, I mean, Gareth Bale troubles me because he's an immensely talented player. Ironically, I think he made his debut against Crystal Palace when I owned them, and we were told about this revelation that was coming out of their youth, their academy setup, and what a player he was. And he came on against us and hit a 35-yard free kick that nearly took the goalkeeper in the back of the net with him. So we saw the early glimpses of Bale, watched him develop, and obviously gone on to Madrid and been this enigma. And I can't understand, having lived in Spain for 20 years myself and know what the Madrileños are like, with people like Steve McManaman and other players that have gone there, why Gareth Bale has fallen out of favour so much at Madrid and why he's become this caricature of a modern-day footballer that seems to want to spend more time off the pitch than on it, with the adages of Wales, golf, and then Real Madrid. Now, his season at Tottenham was poor, but you can make a case that he scored some goals, and actually his goals per game ratio was moderately high. But if you look at the games he scored goals in, they weren't that compelling against that compelling an opposition. Now, if I was at Palace, first of all, Jonathan Barnett, his agent, is not someone I'm particularly fond of, so that conversation would have been very difficult. And secondly, I think Gareth Bale is busted flush. I think you're going to get a very limited amount of games about him. It's like a puncher. The last thing that goes with a boxer, it's like a boxer. The last thing that goes with a boxer is his punch. And with Gareth Bale, you'll get individual moments of brilliance. But in the Premier League, you need more than that. So if I was doing him on a pay and play deal, and he wasn't polluting my dressing room with nonsense about what he may or may not have once earned and what he may or may not have once done, then possibly, but I don't think so. I don't think that's a fit that I'd have been particularly comfortable. It's got a sort of Hollywood feel about it, but not with an A-lister anymore. He's an A-lister on paper, but a B-lister on performance. Arsenal should not want to sell players that have come through their youth policy, that have been developed under the regime of Arsenal's mentality, that have come into their first team, all the endeavours through their academies to bring a young player through, and then not be able to find some sort of solution to the conundrum of getting him to sign a new contract. Now, I know there's an argument that suggests that players that are in his position will be looking for achievements in clubs, will be sort of dictating to the club about what the club has got to do rather than what they've got to do. I think it would be a disappointing day at Arsenal if they don't find the keys to the door to unlock the problem that they've got with this kid signing a new contract. That would be a massive failing on the part of Edu, Arteta, and anyone else in Arsenal that controls to some extent still the direction of travel on this boy's career. The flip side is the boy can control his own destiny, run his contract down. Arsenal will still retain compensation if he were to go because he's under 24, but you'd like to think that they could bottom this out and never let it run down to a contract that has no time left on it. So he should sign a new contract, and they should want him to sign a new contract, and they should find a solution to it. But like anything, the balance of power has shifted towards players, and there needs to be a recalibration of that. We need to get some balance back in the game. It can't all be about players like Mbappe that suddenly start running football clubs from who the director of football is to who the manager is. We are moving into territory that's not cool and not great for football. So Arsenal should not sell him. They should deal with his contract and lock him down. It's a thorny subject, the transgender issue, but it's a very clear one. Biologically, there are two sexes, male and female. You cannot take somebody that's had all the genetic benefits of being a male for most of their life and put them into female sport. It simply isn't fair. I know that puts you into this conundrum of where do these people compete? And maybe there has to be some grown-up discussions about a different set of performance criteria in terms of transgender sports, female sports, men's sports, but under no basis do I think there's any fairness. You're seeing the results. You're seeing the results in cycling. You're seeing the results in swimming, where people that have been born men that are transitioning are competing in women's sport, and it is not right, it is not fair. It shouldn't bring up hostility and hate, and it shouldn't bring up death threats and abuse, but it needs to be dealt with. It is grotesquely unfair. Sharon Davis is absolutely right. She's a sensible voice and a decent voice, and some of the nonsense is going on with people like J.K. Rowling and so on and so forth with fair and honest appraisals are ridiculous, and some of these organisations like Stonewall have got a lot to answer for, but under no circumstances should a person with the biological sex that was born as a man that's transitioning to a woman compete in women's sport. It's not fair and it's not right, and it's certainly not fair to the women athletes that are trying to achieve things that are being marginalised and missing out on opportunities. We saw the powerlifter in the Olympics. We see it. That was one example where it didn't manifest itself in a competitive advantage, but I think that person was 107 when he or she competed. So no, I'm absolutely in the camp that a person born with the biological sex of a male cannot compete in female sports. Lukaku is an enigma because he hasn't really done as much as people think he has done, and I fell into that camp as well last year. I thought he was the cherry on the cake for Chelsea. I thought that he would kick them on, and I said it at the beginning of the season, and so did a couple of my colleagues, about this possibly anyone that finished in front of Chelsea would win the league. And clearly Manchester City and subsequently Liverpool finished in front of them. Chelsea finished third, and I thought Chelsea would win the league. I thought Lukaku was the component that would help them with that. If you look back at his time at Manchester United, he didn't set the world on fire. He didn't have a great goal scoring record. It was decent, but not great. At Everton, he was very good. And at West Bromwich Albion, he had his moments. At Inter Milan, he kind of, tripped the light fantastic, set the world on fire, and gave us this perception that whatever he had the potential to be, he had now become. And somehow this has got lost in translation. Somehow the bright stars that he had lost its way through injury and through ridiculous observations in the press, to this, the Italian media that brought about conflict and confrontation. He hasn't picked up the baton from then. He was forced to climb down and apologise for his ridiculous observations. We haven't seen this massive upturn in form. So the conundrum for Chelsea is, under a new ownership, what's the benefit of keeping Lukaku? He's had 4 or 5 months to pull himself together, and it's not really clearly evident to me that he has. If you've bought him for 97 million euros, I think the figure was, so that's about 85 million quid, and you've put him on a 4-year deal, he depreciates at 22 million pounds a year, so he's on Chelsea's books at 60 odd million quid. If they ship him out for 60 odd million quid, they've got no loss on their balance sheet, and they can go again with somebody that might actually want to be there and somebody that might actually do what they're paid to do. I'm not suggesting that Lukaku doesn't have some of the rights to make some of the observations that he felt. He should have made them to his coach and not Sky Italia, so that they could drop it when they felt like it and cause the maximum amount of disruption. But my view is, if it kind of walks like a duck and it talks like a duck, then it's a duck, and he's a duck, he doesn't really want to be there, so sell him. The hurdles and pitfalls that Nottingham Forest will have to overcome are the same that any promoted club has. You've got the disadvantage of going up through the playoffs, which means you're a little bit behind the 8 ball in terms of timelines, but you know, the recruitment times. Because you get promoted automatically, you've got a 2 or 3 week jump on the guys that are promoted through the playoffs, at the very least. But that notwithstanding, you would have a recruitment and a scouting network that should have done its job and looked at the potential promotion to the Premier League when Forest were knocking on the door for some period of time by being in the playoff spot for some time. So you would have expected them to do their diligence and look around at what's available to them. You'll have the added disadvantage at Forest of this club that once upon a time, albeit a parochial club when Brian Clough and Peter Taylor took it over in the mid-70s, went on to phenomenal heights of winning the old First Division in their first season into it, winning the European Cup at the time with my old manager Trevor Francis scoring the winning goal. And they've got that sort of backdrop and the expectation of their fans. And also, and this is something that Nottingham Forest are not going to like, they're not that good. They're a decent side in the Championship, and yes, you can point to the games they played in the FA Cup against Leicester, but the FA Cup is a one-off game, and a 38-game marathon in the Premier League is like an erosion of your belief. The more difficult it becomes game after game, the more confidence gets sapped. So they've got to get the balance right between what was a side capable of getting out of the Premier League that's full of gusto and belief and collectiveness against a side that needs to change up to stay in the Premier League, and getting that balance right, because all of a sudden you're removing players that are part of the achievement and bringing in new guys, and that causes disenfranchisation in the dressing room. So I think it's going to be a struggle, but Cooper as a manager, I called him a bridesmaid. So he can walk around in his bride's dress now because he won this playoff, and the previous 2, when I called him a bridesmaid, are in the distance. He's a good manager. He's proven it to be the case, and he'll be the difference. Like Thomas Frank was the difference for Brentford. They've got to go in there, believe in themselves, go in there with great confidence, not be grateful to be there. They're there because they deserve to be there. So they go in there with no fear, like Sheffield United did a couple of years ago, like Brentford have done, like Swansea did years ago. And regretfully for me, not like my Palace team did in 2004, went up there with what I thought should have been bravery and went up with a little bit of fear. And attack it and balance their books. £60 million on transfers. 30, 40 million extra on wages, give yourself an opportunity to compete in the division, but if it doesn't work out, you don't sort of mortgage your future and drag yourself into a financial abyss if you get it wrong. But I think Forest have a chance, but they've got to be better than they were by getting out of the Championship. And that might sound bleeding obvious, but it kind of isn't. So I think they've got to spend wisely, be brave, embrace all the facets of Nottingham Forest as a big football club, getting back into the Premier League after 23 years of absence, but also be mindful of the fact that it is a difficult game and there's a balance of probability you might find yourself in jeopardy of getting relegated, and you don't want to damage the long-term position of a club that's now got itself back amongst the mix. Right, that's it for this week's One-to-One. Now don't forget to let me know your thoughts on Southgate, Bale and transgender athletes. Of course, keep liking and subscribing, and I look forward to seeing you next week.